it works, and it is able to take also bold decision. And I think that as it happened in the previous 5 years, it will happen also in the next 5 years. We will.
Mark, I think that's also a great concluding statement. Yeah. So, yeah, Sush, yeah, I'm looking at Mark for it. Right?
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm on the watch. So. It was great. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have our next panel in 10 minutes, so you can grab your lunch at the same time. Thank you very much.
This mess, I put it somewhere. Well, you know, I developed this system allocation. Trying to get an idea. Is a way to, you know, address the refinancing challenge. So your money extremely hard. You have to be able to audit and use that.
Please go. I'm doing what you have to talk to him. I'm just. Maybe I go to the rest of you. Yeah, good. Great. See you. I've never seen you all, but at least. Yeah, I need to guess.
In the middle of
Je veux pas stresser, c'est juste par rapport au prochain panel.
Je ne veux pas me stresser.
Okay, everyone, if you can take your seat, please, and we will start our next session on fragmentation, transformation of the global economy that will be chaired by Renaud Deboc. Let me bring all the panelists. You have a chance to eat something. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, Renaud, over to you. And thank you for all of our panelist speakers for joining us today.
Yes, hi, welcome for a panel on global trade and fragmentation. Will be more topical or not in 2 weeks, we'll see. We're going to go from global to region. So we'll start with Ralph at the WTO for some opening statements.
Oh,
yes.
that was quick. I didn't expect it.
We're on schedule. We're on
That's
schedule.
excellent. That's excellent. Yeah, so thank you very much for having me, and thank you very much for being here. I'm, of course, happy to talk about the changing global economy and also trade fragmentation. And let me maybe start with a kind of a big picture point. So if you were asking me, you know, what's really at the heart of the current globalization crisis, and indeed there is a globalization crisis, I would argue that it's not so much that people have forgotten that international trade brings about efficiency gains, but it's instead that people feel that international trade is part of the problem when it comes to addressing some of the key challenges of our time. And these key challenges of our time, I would say, are to maintain peace and security, including economic security, would be to reduce poverty and inequality, so the whole inclusiveness angle, and then to achieve a sustainable economy. So what we've been trying to do kind of from that starting point, what we've been trying to do at the WTO is try to counter this narrative, and not just from an ideological perspective, of course, but, you know, with evidence, because we do actually believe that international trade is a critical part of the solution. And that's also how we kind of address this fragmentation question. So let me maybe say that, of course, you know, just I think, you know, many of us here on this podium, I think, have made this point before. But of course, we do see first signs of geo-economic fragmentation, particularly if you look at the trade relationship between the United States and China. Very clear, you see that the bilateral trade is growing since the first wave of Trump tariffs is growing 30% more slowly than the trade of the United States and China with third countries, for example. So it's not that trade itself is necessarily dropping, but the trade shares are clearly moving away from China, US. And what we're also seeing, building on Laura's work here in particular, but we can also see that you know, some of this trade now seems to be rerouted through so-called connector countries, you know, Mexico, Vietnam, and so on. Obviously, you can't like literally trace it, but you do see that, you know, some of the direct, I mean, it appears to be, or at least the data are consistent with this interpretation that some of this trade gets rerouted. But then what we also see is that this is not limited just to the China-US relationship, but we've done some broader work where we tried to, so we just divided the world into two hypothetical geopolitical blocks based on voting behavior at the United States, the United Nations General Assembly, who tends to vote with China, who tends to vote with the United States. And what you also see is that trade between these quote unquote blocks is going significantly more slowly than trade within these blocks, starting with more or less with the beginning of the war in Ukraine. So clearly we see these first signs of fragmentation. Now we've done some simulation work a couple of years ago where we, you know, estimated the potential economic costs of this. And we came to the conclusion that kind of worst case scenario, if this geo-economic fragmentation were to continue, the real income losses would be something like 5%, you know, higher for some developing countries. The IMF then later came out with a similar study where they come to 7%, so it's more or less in the same ballpark. But if I just circle back to what I said at the beginning, you know, as important as I think these studies are, and in some sense they don't get at the heart of the issue, because I don't think, you know, if you're really concerned about security, if you're really concerned about inclusiveness, if you're really concerned about sustainability, you're not going to say, well, you know, 5% real income loss is going to deter me from protecting my country, for example. So I think that's why we have to kind of address the matter head on. So let me maybe close by, you know, just focusing on this economic security angle. You know, we could also talk about inclusiveness, sustainability, and so on, but just economic security. So there is the sense somehow that we need less trade if we want to be more resilient, particularly after the pandemic. I think that view has spread quite a bit because there were supply chain disruptions at the beginning. But I do think it's quite clear, you know, both if you look at the evidence, but also if you just think about it a little bit, that trade is actually a source of resilience, at least if it's sufficiently diversified. And you saw that during the pandemic. So trade itself was resilient, actually recovered very quickly within 3/4 of the first wave of lockdowns. But then, of course, also was instrumental in delivering critical goods, medical equipment, but also all our home office equipment and so on to us so that we could actually go through the pandemic. And it stands to reason. I mean, yes, we're living in a more risky world. And yes, there's all sorts of supply shocks that we are exposed to. But I think it is just logical to say, well, if you want to insure yourself against these supply shocks, you need diversified trade, you need multilateral trade, which is why I think the rules-based trading system is also so important, because it does give you the outside options that you need if a crisis hits. So let me maybe stop there, but I could go on for hours, because that's obviously something we're very following very closely.
That's great, and a natural introduction to your work, Clara.
Thanks to the organizers. It's always fun to be in DC, especially seeing how long my hair will last. It usually ends like this in DC humidity. Not all of you relate to that, but that's fine. And I've been in many panels, usually following Ralph, because we tend to have a similar, if you want, position. I have to acknowledge I'm a globalization child. I was born in a very small open economy. I have benefited, or my country has benefited from some of these gains, seeing companies go to one country, hire labor, source inputs and export to others. That little country is Costa Rica. I came to the US, had an amazing career here, studied here, married someone from a different country who also came here. So I do consider myself a globalization child, and I do see with a lot of angst what's going on. I tell my students that this is not helping my middle age crisis. So let me start with something positive and then a little bit more negative. I think on the positive side is that still with all the shocks we have had a lot of resilience. There's been a lot of resilience, in particular in emerging markets, on the back of this reallocation of global value chain. So if you're a low-income or middle-income country in Asia, like Vietnam, or high-income country in Asia, like Korea and Taiwan, you actually have benefit from this reallocation. If you're a country nearby the US, like Mexico, Canada, or even Costa Rica, you have benefit from this reallocation. We have also benefit from the fact that we have had very resilient financial systems. Many countries in Latin America have learned the lessons of the past and have very strong financial systems. And here I'm mentioning Chile, Mexico, Colombia. I know there's some that are not, but we all know who they are. But even in the case of the US, I have research that has showed that a lot of this reallocation has been on the back of a very strong financial system that has helped firms. This is work that I'm doing with folks from the IMF. And also this resilience is on the back of tariff jumping FDI, as Ralph mentioned, a way in which firms have always found a way to go around tariffs, but also increasing costs has been to set shop in some other country. And we do see that is the case of China trying to go to many countries. On the negative side, I do think this backlash against globalization in rich countries is here to stay, and I have to say it's a little bit independent of the political party. One might be a little bit more in your face than the other. We have been doing with David Chor from Dartmouth and Maggie Chen from George Washington University this survey when we randomly tell people good things about trade. Trade gives us jobs, trade gives us low prices, tariffs gave us high prices. We cannot convince people that trade is good. So there was a moment that we're like, if I tell you good things about trade, why are you still against trade? Because people cannot differentiate the threat of China, security, and jobs. And unless we address those issues, it's going to be, at least in the US, very hard to go back. And on top of that, add to that now that we have eaten a lot of the fiscal space, a lot of this election in the US feels a little bit like populism in Latin America. Everyone is offering a lot of tariffs, a lot of subsidies, a lot of perks. And then when they want more votes, they just double down. Again, this fiscal space, even for the US that has a special advantage, it's starting to become an issue, which will probably just complicate things going forward because a lot of what we have seen has been on the strength and the growth of the US. So let me add that, finish with that in terms of concerns.
Thank you. Wolf, what does it look like from Europe?
Yeah, so what does it look like from Europe? What does it look like from the perspective of a crisis resolution mechanism? And we are mainly concerned about disruption in a way. And just to give a perspective also to what the commissioner said before, to what Carl and Laura said before, if you think in terms of trade openness, so exports and imports account for almost 60% of Euro area GDP. And for China, the number is 34%. For the US, the number is 25%. That just kind of illustrates how tremendously important that topic is for us. Then, I mean, if I look at it, there are the longer term trends, there are the short term risks. On the longer term trends, I completely agree with what Ralph said. There is this kind of more bimodal shaping up of trade. If you think at different blocks and you see a disintegration between the US aligned bloc and the China-Russia aligned bloc, if you wish, like this in terms of global trade. And we should be aware of the costs, not only the long-term costs, but also the short-term costs that this may have in terms of supply and also in terms of prices. I mean, and after all, with the big difference between the US and Europe was the terms of trade shock that Europe experienced with Russia, which cost us 3% of GDP per year, basically. Now, the point is that there is this longer term trend. At the same time, we also look at the short-term potential for disruption. And if you look at it from a European perspective, notice that 70% of trade is coming to Europe via maritime routes. And one of the things that has an effect is what we call the so-called butterfly effect. Imagine conflict coming up in some region and that actually disrupting trade again. If you think about a conflict in the Southeast Asian Sea for political reasons, and that cuts trade from China to Europe, from our perspective, the cost would be almost as big as the cost that we saw with Russia, Ukraine, the Ukraine war. So there is quite some potential for disruption that one must be aware of. And obviously you can do a lot in order to try to get there and diversify. But again, if you look at energy, 30% of the energy coming to Europe goes through the Strait of Hormuz. And that's, so to speak, difficult to avoid. And again, if there's a disruption, would be costly for us. So that's an element of vulnerability that we must be aware of. Second point, in terms of vulnerabilities, there is the issue of finance. And obviously, you also look at the financial side. And what you see is also when you look at finance, that there is some alignment of investment, assets and liabilities across political aligned constituencies. Okay, so you see this. If you look at it from a European perspective, then our exposure to countries that are less politically aligned is not big, but it is in the order of 10% of GDP, which, and in some countries, there's some country variation, but the point is that even that can be disruptive. I mean, that is then allocated mainly, or you see a bigger exposure in portfolio investment and in FDI. And if you have kind of a reversal of flows, that obviously can create some financing constraints. And here, what we also find is that Europe, obviously, on the financial side, to a large extent, benefits from a safe haven status. But if political risks heighten, then Europe, or at least part of Europe, loses that status, which means that there is stronger reversal of flows, which again has then very different implications on financing conditions and can also affect the financing of governments at a time when this may be critical. So there is a point where we have to think about very seriously, and that is why I support what you said on resilience. Resilience as a key concept, and also what the commissioner said before. I think Europe has been greatly resilient, but there is still more to go, and that is an important piece of the policy agenda forward going. And I think I also stop at that, and we can discuss later.
Deborah, what have European firms been doing?
Yeah, and I think I continue. We have a lot of European focus, so I'm very glad that you will bring a different also perspective. Actually, no, it's a mix. But so on the European point of view, I think I very much concur with what Rolf was saying. For Europe, actually, it's a much in the European DNA, and also in terms of the economic model, the trade, the openness to trade and globalization. Europe has strongly benefited in the last years from integration of Central Eastern Europe in global trade, and also benefit from reallocation of production, particularly of energy-intensive industry, and at the same cheap energy at home. But these are factors that are vanishing. So both of them are not vanishing for Central Eastern Europe, but the upside is kind of internalized. And the discussion in terms of the cheap energy costs inside Europe are less relevant. There is a much more uncertainty on the stability of the cost. And on the other side, now even the localization of production is somehow challenged. But even in this context, what we have seen is that while the US, and it's what Laura was mentioning before, as this very much, this I would rechanneling of its import from China via Vietnam and Mexico, Europe still has kept in the last years its strong ties even with China, and actually also with the US. And at this stage, somehow Europe has less to gain and much more to lose in terms of the disintegration of the supply chains. Because of all of this, we have been looking, we have done a special, it's part of the work that we do. We analyze the behavior of firms, and we have a surveys that we repeat every year. Actually, we look at a firm in the EU, also in the US, and we had a special module also looking at trade shocks. And it's very interesting because what we see is that at the end, European firms really care about resilience and are not looking for retrenching. So what we have seen is that European firms have suffered from the trade shock in the last years. In 2023, 30% more or less of the firms that we interviewed, 12,000 in Europe, so it's quite significant, had a serious major disruption on commodity, logistics, access to components. In 2024, so just this year, the survey was released yesterday, 20% of, so these, if you want, specifically trade really physical related shocks somehow were decreasing. What is starting, it's to some 20%. What is starting to become more material for the firms is a constraint in terms of complying to new regulation and complying to uncertainty on tariff. So you have a shift in the perception of firms. Before it was the Suez Canal, maybe that's still there, but before it was a more physical problem in trade, and that now it's a more geopolitical problem with trade, complying with regulation and complying with tariff. But the interesting part is when we ask firms what do they do to react to the shock, and then the first answer is they invest in inventories, they invest in digital tracking. Digital tracking is quite important because it allows you to keep control of your supply. Something happens, you can react very quickly. And then what the firms were doing was diversifying, particularly those importing from China. They all went on the China +1. So we really see on the data on the fact of diversifying and adding another potential source. We also ask firms if they would consider, if they were substituting import with domestic production or production within Europe. And the answer was basically no. Very, very little firms are doing it. So we see that in Europe, the focus is really resilience more than retrenching. We also could look, actually we have done some study in trying to understand which firms are better in reacting. And it's interesting to see that the way I like to see it is what makes you better, makes you also better in terms of resilience. So are really the most innovative firms, those with a better management, those that are more productive, those that are already digital, that actually the best, the fastest to invest in resilience and then actually remaining resilience. There is one element important. If a firm is a finance constraint, gets the shock, is not able to react. So that's on the policy point of view, finance constraints are very important element to look. So out of this analysis, I think I go back to the point of saying in Europe, there is probably more to lose at this stage of a process of retrenching, and actually our companies are understanding it, and they really go for having a more resilient supply chain rather than retrenching. It goes on the European policy debate. Of course, in Europe, we have a lot of debates, and this is something that is evolving. So there is no fixed answer of what will be the policy point of view in Europe. I still think, I know that there is a lot of talking about how aggressive in terms of industrial policies is the Draghi report. I notice one part that while speaking a lot on industrial policy on the one side, and even some kind of protectionism, etc., there is also a nice box on the side that speaks about the benefit of globalization and free trade. So I think it really reflects the way of thinking in Europe. The way of thinking is still integration, the value of integration. And yes, we have to do it in a sustainable way. But resilience and sustainability, I think, is something very important in Europe. I hope people don't disagree too much with me.
It's an optimistic message, more resilience.
And that's it.
Thanks to tariffs and pandemic. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to this roundtable discussion. Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about the ASEAN +3 region, which is ASEAN 10 plus China, Korea, and Japan. I'd like to start by, discussing the features of the region. The region is not homogeneous, it's very diverse, as you know, it consists of very advanced and very middle income and low income economies. And also, so basically the region is countries are at different stages of development, right? And the region is stitched together by trade and investment, basically. And that has developed over the years, over the last 40, 50 years, right? So we like to think of the region as a flying geese formation with the advanced economy at the top, the middle income in the middle, and then the low income at the bottom. And so this basically represents the production network in the region, right? Which has come together over many years, and also due to reconfiguration of trade and investment and all that. So when I look back over the years, starting for instance with in the 80s, the Plaza Accord, when the yen was had appreciated sharply, and there was a massive inflow of investment into the ASEAN countries, right? And so that started the regional production network, and then subsequently when China became part of the WTO, right, a lot of the low-end manufacturing were out, basically hollow out and moved to China. And again, it was a reconfiguration of trade in the region. From Singapore, I was working in the central bank at that time, and there was a very depressing period because we were hit by the Asian financial crisis, and at the same time there was this reconfiguration of trade. So reconfiguration trade has been a feature of the region for a long time. It's not new. That's what I'm trying to say. And the region has always been able to restructure, reconfigure in order, in response to changing shocks. And so this time around, we know, the shock coming from the pandemic, and because of that, there's a drive to build greater resilience, diversification, and there's the geopolitics, the friction between China and Japan. There's restructuring again, the production in the network in the region. And so far, I think, as I mentioned, that the region is not homogeneous. So different parts of the region will benefit or lose from this restructuring. But so far, what we have seen in the region is that the ASEAN countries are very well positioned to benefit from this restructuring of the global trade because of the China +1 strategy adopted by many companies, not just Western companies, but even Chinese companies, which have been restructuring for some time already. It's not even before the trade war started, right? And now with the trade war, it's like another, a repeat of the Plaza Accord. You have a massive outflow of production from China into the ASEAN region, and ASEAN countries have been positioning themselves, to try to attract as much of this investment as possible, and they're very well positioned because they have a very developed manufacturing ecosystem, and so a lot of the MNCs are moving their production to the ASEAN countries because of that. So far, I think this reconfiguration of trade arising from the China-US conflict, but also because of technology and because of rising costs in China, has actually benefited ASEAN countries quite a lot. As long as the friction doesn't lead to a bifurcation of the global economy to two different zones, which I don't think is possible in any case, because I think the global economy is much bigger than either the US or China, right? So as long as it's just a reconfiguration of the existing structure of trade, then I don't think, in countries there'll be winners and losers, but countries will be able to manage this reconfiguration. And we have seen that, over the years. It happened, as I mentioned, after China accession to the WTO. And again, after the global financial crisis, when demand collapsed in US and Europe, we saw that again a restructuring of global supply chain, and that's when a lot of people thought there's a deglobalization. But actually, it wasn't deglobalization. It was because the Asian countries were boosting demand in order to offset the impact of the decline in external demand. So a lot of the supply chain got sucked into China at that point in time, but the supply chain was still there, and so I see this as a continuation of the global process of change, driven by technology, by geopolitics, and other forces. Thank you.
Thank you. Then maybe a question for Ralph and Laura. Then we heard the word resilience a lot in trade. Maybe also helps explain why we've seen some disinflation. So global supply chains have pressures have alleviated, but we have an election coming up. 60% tariffs on proposed on Chinese imports to the US. How do you see the spillovers right now from such a big tariff increase, for example, in the US? Is the world more ready? Or is that exaggerating?
So first of all, let me actually agree with I really do tend to agree with Laura. I'm sorry, but the resilience part I think is actually really important. It's quite remarkable if you think about it. I mean, what we've thrown at the world economy in general and international trade in particular, and how it's holding up. But I would like to push back a little bit against one thing that she said, and also one thing that you said, which is going to relate to your question. So both of you have kind of implied that, well, maybe this geo-economic fragmentation and could also be good for some countries because it, gives business to Vietnam, to Mexico, to Canada, and so on. And I would just caution a little bit here. So of course, in the short run, I think that's correct. But I also think that we have to make sure that this geo-economic fragmentation doesn't come at the expense of the rules-based trading system. Because if the long, and you kind of said it also, right, that if the longer term implication of these geo-economic tensions is that we have a power-based trading system and not a rules-based trading system, you also don't want to be a small developing country anymore competing. Even if perhaps in the short run you gained, and this is also how I would approach this question that you asked now about the U.S. elections. Of course, as a WTO official here, I can't comment on individual members' trade policies. But what I can say is that tariffs are not set in stone in the WTO. So individual members make commitments, and they're free to depart from these commitments, but there's a way to do it. And the way to do it would be in cooperation and consultation with other trading partners. So I think that's really the key. And if instead we are moving towards a unilateral approach where countries just kind of start doing whatever they want pretty much, I think then we have a problem. And that's how I view it. And maybe two related considerations. So you may argue, or some of you may think that, well, I'm talking here about the rules-based trading system, but isn't it broken anyways? So who cares? My answer there would be a strong no. I would be the first to admit that the WTO is not has challenges. The WTO is in need of reform. I would agree that, there's not a Uruguay round coming anytime soon, but I would still insist that the WTO is delivering on its key functions. There are outcomes of WTO negotiations. We continue to implement trade agreements in important ways. And even on dispute settlement, I can go into that if you want, we are delivering. But let me just give you one number, my favorite statistic. More than, so I keep saying it, so forgive me if I said it before, or you've heard it before, but more than 75% of world trade continues to be conducted directly under WTO terms today. So under the most favored nation tariffs of the WTO, and the remaining 25% is largely conducted in free trade agreements that are in turn constrained by WTO rules, for example, to be free trade agreements. Right? Because, what's a free trade agreement? Substantially all tariffs are zero. Why are substantially all tariffs zero? Because that's the rule of the WTO. So I would really urge everyone, and in particular businesses, not to mistake perhaps the slower pace of progress at the WTO and perhaps the difficulty we have with our appellate body, for example, with now concluding that this place is irrelevant and therefore saying we can start taking unilateral trade policy action that completely disregards the rules that we have. And by the way, that applies to industrial policy too. So that's really my main concern, because if you think about, and that's the second and last point, if you think about what the WTO delivers or rules-based trading system delivers, it's low tariffs, yes, but it's also trade policy certainty. And I think that's really the key, because if you live in a world where everything's kind of power-based, then maybe tomorrow the tariffs are 30%, and maybe next day they're 40%. I mean, that alone, even if nothing is changing, is going to have a hugely detrimental effect on trade. So really anchoring these expectations, I think, is an important part of what we do.
Let me just add that I completely agree with you. The work that we have done with David Chor, who's from Singapore, another small open economy, and Maggie has that conclusion that politicians in the US are feeding from this fear that people have, and thus acted and created the tariffs. So I'm not representing anyone other than myself, so I can speak freely. President Trump may have many issues, but one thing that he was good at was picking up ratings, and that's the rating that he picked up. The people were angst. There was some angst, and he acted with tariffs. But let me remind you that the Biden administration didn't get rid of them and double down with industrial policy. And so that is the concern. Sometimes my European friends get upset with this, but this round of globalization has had a strong anchor in the US. I'm not saying that the Europeans have not played a role, but a strong anchor has been the US, and it does feel that the system has lost that anchor. Even being from Costa Rica, we may have fights with the US and the WTO. We would go to the WTO with the US, and the US would back down. That sense has been lost. It's not a reliable partner, if you want. And that I do agree with you. That does keep me very much awake at night. What's going to happen going forward? And as I said, every time you pick up the newspaper in the US, it's a contest of who does more. It is true that one is a little bit more outrageous than the other one, but we already have tariffs against EVs. It is true that in the US, no one buys EVs from abroad, so that's why no one cared. But that trend is there, and that is a big concern. Who at the end of the day, this system that we have lived has always been by sovereign players. And if the sovereign players don't want to behave, then we don't have anyone else from Venus or Mars coming to tell them what to do. So we do need them to be willing to play in this system, and that anchor has been lost. On your question of prices, tariffs at the end of the day are a change in relative price. They're not inflationary. Now, it's very hard for people to sometimes see the difference, because sometimes the effect on prices is slow moving, and thus it feels like a constant increase in prices. Our work has documented that the tariffs had previous work has shown that the tariffs had a price effect, but our work shows that reallocation is also expensive. Any good that used to be in China is now being brought from Vietnam, on average is 10% more expensive. More will mean, again, more relative price increases, which for the people will feel like inflation. And there is a congratulating ourselves that we defeated inflation, but the reality is that in the US, things are very expensive, and what matters to people is purchasing power, and their purchasing power went down. So already they're unhappy because we use inflation to pay for the little party that we have, and it's not going to get better with more tariffs.
Yeah, one of the points Arend and the team makes at UBS is to say that the profit margins of American corporates came somewhat under pressure as well. So maybe you're going to have a less buffer this time around if you have these big tariffs. But I pick up that the US is going to be a problem for Europe in any administration. So Ralph.
Well, that's a bold statement.
I'm just citing an unaffiliated.
Now let me take one point. So on fragmentation and who could benefit or not. So one of the questions obviously is if the trade conflict between the US and China becomes fiercer, what it would be the consequence of for Europe. And could there be a positive effect for Europe? And I mean, just from a general perspective, I mean, it would be costly globally in terms of demand. It would also, I think, not benefit Europe in a sense that if China would divert exports, then, I mean, what we see is that China has actually stepped up on the technological ladder and is now competing on more products with Europe. So it could actually be that the competition for Europe and European products becomes even fiercer. And then there is the question, and here maybe I deviate a little bit from what others say on the panel in a sense that as Commissioner Gentiloni said, and as Deborah said, I mean, Europe is wired to be open and play by the rules. But if you're the only one left who plays by the rules, you're hit. So that is also why there is this thinking in Europe, what is it that we can actually do in order to kind of strengthen our, if you wish, defensive forces in that regard. And what one must acknowledge in Europe, and here we come also to this question of what the Draghi report and what it can do about competitiveness, the way Europe is constituted, it's easier to work on tariffs than to work on a common industrial policy, because that's a competence of the European Commission, which is why you see that what other countries may be doing in terms of industrial policy in Europe may more easily spill over into trade policy. So there is a point where that one, I think, should be aware of, and that I think where Europeans rightfully reflect on how they want to position themselves. Second point, briefly on resilience. Resilience for me is broader, substantively broader than just question of trade diversification. And when we said we were resilient over the past crisis, that is also because we had the policy space. And after all, it was a heavy reaction of monetary policy, heavy reaction of fiscal policy that actually could kind of stabilize the economy. Some of that space is gone now. And so the question is, you need to do more in order to increase your resilience than just trade diversification. Single market, I mean, I thought it was very daunting what Deborah said, because big part of the agenda in Europe needs to be the single market. What can we take out of this? And there is really this issue, why do companies see the single market not really as much as an opportunity as we would wish them to do? Right, and so much more needs to happen there because trade barriers within or kind of barriers within the single market are still too big. Second point, we also need to make sure that we have in the future the fiscal space, and that means that we need to act on the national level, but also think about what was discussed before, the European pool of resources that is available to address those issues.
Seems the European Investment Bank is expected to take a somewhat larger role, so certainly in defense as well.
I actually start answering to something that Ralph just said. On the single market, I actually think I forgot a piece before of what I was saying. What I was saying at the beginning was that Europe benefited a lot on the integration of Central Eastern Europe, and that part is finished. And that was the part I forgot to say is that was kind of the easy pick. So you integrate somebody and you get the benefit. One part where much more has to be done at the European level is the completion of the single market in terms of trade. We have always in our survey, I go back to that, this year we were asking firms if they perceive, so if when they export to another European countries for their main product are subject to differentiated standards or consumer protection rule or other friction that complicate the export to another European country. For most, I think for all product in Europe, in a functioning integrated single market, you should have 0% of firms saying yes. I think maybe not zero, maybe in some sector, but we have 60% of firms saying that it's a concern for their export within the market. And this tells you that we really also have to do a lot in terms of integrating more within Europe in the single market. And I think that's an important point. Thank you for rebringing this. on playing by, and you also mentioned the playing by the rule, and I fully agree with that. But I think, I don't know, I'm not specifically a trade expert, but and there are people much more knowledgeable than me at the table. But I think responding to what is perceived excessive subsidies from another counterpart, etc., can be just playing by the rule if you do it well. I think that is not the problem. I think the problem is then the escalation, the escalation and the concept that you continue to try to protect too much. And to me, it remains something. I remember when I was studying, and I have it so much in my mind that it's always a matter of choosing the technologies. So if it's a standardized technology, it's really a commodity product, why do you have to protect yourself? Yes, there may be a security issue, but the security issue is so limited, and for very limited number of products. Then if you have developing technologies, spillover from innovation are huge, etc., that's a different story. But for the really commodity product, I think we have to really look granular to find which limited areas we really justify security concern.
Oh, maybe one last question for you before turning to the audience. I mean, Chinese policymakers are responding to the growth slowdown. What are the repercussions potentially for the region?
Sorry.
You have a slowdown in China right now. They're to some extent rethinking their growth model. I mean, what are the implications for the region?
Yeah, well, China is going through a soft patch, but also quite structural. And we know that the real estate sector, there's been a drag on the economy, right? And recently they've been taking a lot of measures to boost the growth. So I think with the recent set of measures that they've taken, that's going to show up in the last quarter and next year in terms of somewhat stronger growth. So I know that the economy is slowing down, but when you look at the long-term growth trend, I mean, it's going to slow down anyway because it becomes more and more advanced, more and more developed. The question is how much of that is structural, driven by, because the economy is getting more advanced and because of aging population, because of all these structural factors, and how much of it is because of the imbalance in the real estate sector, which is a drag on growth. And my sense is that the drag on growth from the real estate sector, we had initially thought it was going to turn around by the end of this year, but then it turns out that we are off, and we look at the real estate cycle again, and it looks like it's going to turn around sometime in the middle of next year. But with the latest set of measures, I think it's going to turn around sooner now. So our sense is the growth will be around 5%. That's our forecast. But China's growth although China's growth has been maybe a drag on growth for other countries in the region, it was also a drag on commodity prices. Let's not forget that, right? When China came out of the pandemic back in 2023, right, it was very sharp, and everybody thought that demand for oil prices was going to go through the roof. And at that time, the forecast that oil price is going to $100 a barrel. That didn't happen, right? Because subsequently the economy took a dive again. So I think China's slowdown has two aspects. One is structural, which is driven by EVs and those kind of production, manufacturing, where it's productivity that's driving down the prices of those prices. And that would be a huge benefit for countries, that are not, this is a competing industry. And there's going to be I think a sort of a disinflating factor for the global economy, right? On the other hand, with the strong rebound in China, they're going to have demand for commodities and other products. And that's going to show up in some of the commodities, not everything, because I think China has reached a stage of development where going forward, its demand for commodities is not going to be very intensive. And that's going to be, I think a drag on growth for the commodity producing economy. So, there's a balance there that we need to take into account. On the one hand, China is, super productive or overcapacity in some jargon, where it is driving prices down of manufacturing product. It is automating, its production. And I think that's it's affecting not just the rest of the world, but China itself, because I think a lot of the labor is going to be displaced from the manufacturing sector. But at the same time, so there is going to be a downward pressure on prices. But on the other hand, I think China will put upward pressure on the global economy when it starts to come out of this downturn. But overall, my sense is that the input coming from the goods sector is going to be on the downside. The services sector, on the other hand, is pretty strong, even in China, not just in the US, but also in China. When you look at when you break down the prices in the services and goods, services is the one that's keeping inflation positive, because the goods prices is already very negative, as we all know. But there's going to be a shakeout in the goods sector because of this, overcapacity, and at some point it's going to come to an equilibrium level. But in any case, I think whatever the equilibrium level is, structurally we see that it's going to be on a downtrend.
Questions from the audience? I have to take Adam first. Yeah, it's my boss.
Thank you. Maybe it's a question for the Europeans on the panel. What would be the likely European response to U.S. tariffs? And I guess it doesn't just need to be a tariff response. It could be other things like exporter subsidies or any kind of, we did a sort of a poll among our own team about what the response will be in each country to a 10% tariff. And so surprisingly to me, the vast majority thought we would not get a proportional response in the countries that they covered. I'm just curious my prior is there will be, but my question is, what would Europe do?
I mean, hard to predict precisely, but I mean, from my perspective, I think it would fit what I said before. So, and what also we have seen in the past when there were tariffs imposed on European products, you saw some retaliation. What I don't see is that you have individual country retaliation because it's an EU competence, right? So there will be an EU reaction to that. And again, the reaction is more likely to be through trade policy and through tariffs than through subsidies, because I mean, one of the key points on the Draghi report is that he asked for this coordination of industrial policy to also have kind of identify industries and have kind of a common subsidy policy. The thing what the European Commission can do and where the competence is, you can ensure that there is a single market and that there is, so to speak, kind of everyone plays by the rules in having national subsidy policies, but you have not the competence of a common policy in that regard. So that is why my take is, if something in that regard happens and there will be tariffs imposed by the US, there will be a reflection in Europe what you can do. There is the possibility of retaliation, but it will in any case be a European response.
Other views? Italian matters? That's... Other question?
Non-political.
Non-political, yes.
Well, that's good.
No one answer.
You can answer, you're free.
Good afternoon, thank you very much.
Okay.
Europe is the loser of the global race. Low level of digitalization, high level of financing costs, high level of energy prices. The public data from Netherlands show the contraction of the exports of goods of Eurozone by around 3% for the period January-July compared to the same period a year ago, while the industrial production in Europe contracted by around 4%, January-July 2023. Completely in divergence with what is happening in China or United States. In this context of competitiveness, do you think possible to use more the economic diplomacy, because it's one of the solutions that is not being used by Europe in order to improve the commerce, the trade with, for instance, Asia? We are living in Asian century. Everybody's talking about high growth space in Asia. And on the other hand, why not to invest more in Africa? Because most of the African countries used to be former colonies of the European countries. Thank you very much.
Wolf, that's for you.
I mean, there is a point that there are common initiatives, obviously also when it comes to trade, but there is also national initiatives still going on. I mean, politicians traveling to China, traveling to the US in order to make arrangements, because there are still also national interests. We will see how that evolves in the future. And I do agree that it would be very good in order to preserve the European position if there were more coordination.
More questions?
This usually happens after lunch.
After lunch, okay.
Coffee time.
Coffee then, coffee time, Mark?
Coffee.
That's a wrap then, yes, thank you. Niet goed in
I
hè?
would say.
On the importance of financial system.
I sent you, so I didn't.
So this result, what it was, this result that finds out is very good. That's exactly what the paper shows, like, in the US bank.
I learned so much.
I will just say, we will reconvene in 15 minutes for the last panel on emerging markets. You can have a coffee break. Thank you. No.
But what I was mentioning on barriers and response is already listed just published. But we have the study that on one of the barriers is on the other one, and I will send it.
Thank you very much.
Yes, I have your.
Yeah.
Thanks so much. This year is crazy. I'm actually going to China in November for the China International.
Oh, that's November 5.
You know better than This time I'm only going for that day. It's already and then I have sessions, but it's actually very interesting in China. About China.
I write to you. I don't scale you.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Thank you very much.
Very good.
Yeah, right. Sounds good. No, I'm very interested in learning more about China.
I write to you. On va vous inviter. Oh, it was a long day. It was so many sessions.
Gracias. Gracias.
I think let me double check. Yes. And I don't know if you have the chance to say that we don't have how much. Yeah, so I think it would be great if you could give us a view about and then we have the yes. And then we have the academics. Well, I'm not sure if both an academic and also. And then we have the hospitals. And then. Yeah. And so this was the first round. Then I thought that in terms of for sure impact on the infection is a big topic. So I wanted to go see and then maybe we can also
the China and US policy was created. The first is resilience,
and what next
first.
I'm sure the well
I'm not sure whether they can.
I'm sure. And then we have the second round where I raise the more specific topics.
And the first was
one would be the impact of the solution, and of course, the second one would be about China, and the third one maybe a little more about investment.
Very good presentation.
I know that you have a hard stop at 2 o'clock. No, but we are pretty close. There's not a beautiful place in the world as a Machu Picchu. I did the Inca Trail. Yes. I did the 5 days walk. Well, I tell you, at 5,000 meters, they told me, do you want a donkey? Because I couldn't. I say, no, no way. Every 2 minutes, I stop. It's really tough. But what is beautiful is that you're right at the top. And then the same day you go down to the forest. It's a incredible thing. It's really magical. It's a magical place. So should we have a seat and we can go?
And we're going to be very well, I think, with the future.
Bien, bien, bien. Aprovecho que ahora que no estoy en el fondo, Sì, sì, no, no, perché no, bisogna inserire Raffaele.
Noi stiamo
Lo passativo.
sì, non per i passativi voi.
La noce che avete sempre per quello più tardi, quello della mañana, ma si llegamos a
Hay sindicatos que uno idea de pacientes que eran gourmet, le pensaban mejor más que hagan una idea.
wow.
Solo eso así. No, pero sí, tiene buena cosita.
Sí, está con John Fernando, que era vino también un poco de casa, vivimos juntos.
¿Dónde estuviste?
Es un tipo muy bueno. No habla español. Bueno.
So you're in UBS.
I'm in UBS Asset Management, and we are in the team. I'm the head of strategy for the team dealing mainly with sovereign wealth funds and central banks. So the whole topic of RMB dollar payments is a big topic for us.
Right.
We can discuss sanction,
Dollarization,
de-dollarization.
Yeah.
I think they will. Okay.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. If you can take your seat, please. And we are going to start the last panel of the day, Emerging Market Resilience, that will be chaired by Massimiliano Castelli from UBS. Massimiliano, over to you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes, you can. If you can please take a seat. Thank you so much so that we can start. So first of all, I would like to thank Smart Reason for putting together once again a very successful event. UBS has been supporting Reinventing Bretton Woods Committee for quite a few years now in a row. And there is a tradition that our colleagues from the investment bank are in captain. And those of you who were here this morning, you might have heard, they focus more on, let's say, the Western world, the advanced economy bloc. And instead, I focus more on emerging markets. And actually, that's exactly the topic of the last panel of the day, which is about resilience in emerging market. Now, I was thinking when I look at the agenda with Mark in the last few weeks, we talk about resilience continuously, right? We talk about resilience of the US economy. We talk about resilience of emerging market. In the previous panel, I heard about resilience of the international trade system. It looks like despite all the geopolitics and all the events surrounding us, the global economy, at least on the real side of the world, is resilient, which I think is great. And I'm very happy to see that also emerging markets are pretty resilient. And to continue the conversation and broadening to talk about emerging market perspective a little bit more, I'm very glad to have a great panel. And we have two policymakers, actually 2.5, right? 3, or because you're, as I will tell you in a minute, we have an academic who is a policymaker, but Giulio Velarde, the governor of the Central Bank of Peru. We are waiting for Mr. Virag, the deputy governor. He's on his way and he will join us in a few minutes. And then, as I said, we have two academics, Anusha Chari, professor of economics, University of North Carolina, but she's also sitting in the Council of Economic Advisor of the White House, and Pirosha Mohasky, I hope I said it correctly, who is instead, can I say you're a pure academic?
Yeah.
No policy making,
anymore.
and from the London School of Economics and Political Science. So the idea would be to have before the governor and the deputy governor to give their perspective from the government, from the central banking point of view, and then I will pass the floor to our two guests on my right, and what type of topics do we want to tackle. I ask the panelists to address three questions, which are also the questions that we discuss very much in my position as head of strategy for a sovereign institution at UBS Asset Management, which is, first of all, what are the factors of resilience and success in the fight of inflation and resilience growth in emerging markets? As you know, emerging markets have been going through a pretty, I would say, sharp US interest rate cycle, very strong dollar. I remember many years ago, it was enough to talk about rising interest rate. I remember the taper tantrum. It was enough to mention interest rate rising before having a big impact on emerging market. This time around, emerging market have been doing remarkably well in the face of this external challenge on the monetary policy side. So it's great to have the governor and the deputy governor giving their perspective. The second question is to look a little bit ahead. Well, where are we now? As the US interest rates start falling and over Western central banks start decreasing interest rates, how are emerging market positioned to take advantage? I would say of this a little bit more benign environment compared at least to what has been the case for the last a few years. And then, of course, we will also like to talk about a topic which you heard a lot in Washington, D.C. in this day, which is the whole question about the global safety, financial safety net. But I would broaden the perspective also say it's about the governance. It's about how we are going to deal with the challenge we currently face. And I think it's coming now on board, so we can welcome the Deputy Governor. Thank you so much, please. And so without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Giulio Velarde, Governor of Central Bank of Peru, to give his perspective in his opening remarks. Thank you, Governor.
First, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here as always. Resilience. First, I believe that we have learned through the years to manage better the economic situation. We have improved credibility. During COVID years, during 2020, we went rapidly to almost zero rate of interest. That was unthinkable 20 years ago. That is, as we gain credibility, many of the central banks in emerging markets had been able to have countercyclical monetary policies. Before, it was very hard. The crisis of 1998, with a strong pressure on the exchange rate, it was very hard to use a countercyclical monetary policy. Even in the crisis after Lehman, many of the emerging market countries were reluctant to reduce the interest rate at first. When the currency stabilized after the soft lines given to Mexico, Brazil, Singapore, and Korea, we were able to reduce interest and reduce it pretty quick. In our case, we moved it to 1%, 1.25. But compared to the 90s, we have improved the ability to intervene with monetary policy. The scenario has been in part more benign. 1998, there was a big outflow from emerging markets in general after the Russian crisis. Of course, before was the Russian crisis, but Russian crisis not paying the bonds was even stronger. In our case, we were depending at that time of financing from foreign banks in the short-term lines of credit. 50% of the expansion of credit the first half of the year was financed by lines of credit from foreign banks. That led to a crisis. In 2008, didn't happen something like that. It happened in Eastern Europe that were too dependent maybe from loans from foreign banks, but in the rest of emerging markets were not so strong. What we have seen we economists sometimes invent silly names. In the 90s, there was a phrase that was called original sin, the inability of emerging markets to finance in domestic currency. The original sin disappeared. We started to issue paper in domestic currency, and it's the majority now. 2001, our country started a little bit before. And we are less dependent of financing foreign currency. Of course, there have been moments like 2020 with the COVID, there was less appetite for bonds in domestic currency, and we have to issue more bonds in foreign currency in dollars. But in general, we have still supported markets. Of course, there have been periods of tension. Of course, 2008, 2008, that lasted only 6 months. 2020, during COVID, that markets were not closed, but there was less appetite for paper in domestic market, the domestic currency. We were able to issue 100-year bonds at less than 4% in dollars in that year. So the market were open, but we're a little bit closer to domestic currency. What we have seen recently is that source of capital has not followed a continuous trend, a continuous tendency. Between 2009, March 2009, and the announcement of the tapering, there was big influx of money. Actually, we're buying dollars at almost 6 or 7% of GDP per year, and we're appreciating 5-6% per year. The inflow were enormous. Everybody was betting in the same direction, and it was continuous. After the tapering, everybody was betting in the opposite direction. And of course, we suffered some pressure because a lot of money entered before. That is not the case now. We have not had these inflows before in only one direction for many years. What happens lately is that one quarter, there might be inflows, the other quarter outflows, but they had not been so big as before. And I would say resilience, because we have been able to manage monetary policy independently of the Fed in a good part. And also, the market distinguishes between countries better. The last time we were affected by a country in Latin America was Brazil, Lula election 2002. Since 22 years ago, it can happen something to Mexico, Argentina, Brazil, and our bonds almost do not suffer because markets distinguish between countries. That was not the case before because the issuance of bonds in the market was much smaller for the, let us say, we were outside the markets, we were active in markets all Latin America in the 20s. Then the market was closed, it started opening after the Brady plan, and they will start to issue bonds, but it has been rather recent. In the last 25 years, that this increase in bonds that we issue in the markets have been more important. And we have been able to resist in spite of all these factors. Just to mention one particular case in Peru that is idiosyncratic, we elected 2021 the most radical leftist president of history that made people afraid of the property right of their savings, etc. We had the biggest outflow of Peruvians taking their money out, almost 8% of GDP. We didn't show to any kind of capital control. When he was elected, the rate was 0.25. When this outflow finished, the rate was, we started increasing the rate because of inflation, not because of that. And when we stopped at the end, it finished, it was less than 1%, still the rates. Before, in the past, we have reacted, probably increasing the rate, we could not be unable to maintain the rate. So I believe we have more instruments to manage somewhat before. Of course, we are not immune to a crisis and we can be affected. This crisis of increasing the rate affects so much because we were before increasing the rate already. When Powell was announcing in Jackson Hole that inflation was transitory, we have already started increasing the rate. We have already had 4 or 5 times increasing the rates. And we finished in 7.75. Our last increase we are now 5.25, and we have been decreasing rates since the last September of last year. So we actually, that is, we were already with rates above the Fed when they started raising the interest rates. So probably that has affected this. as in a certain way. No, I stop there because you have other questions. I don't want to extend myself so much.
We will expand on that. And first of all, let me welcome Bernard Virac, Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Hungary. So you heard the first question I was posing to all the panelists was to reflect a little bit on the fight against inflation, how emerging market performance, the resilience of emerging market in the face of this condition. It will be great to get your perspective from another part of the world, Central Eastern Europe.
First of all, good afternoon. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here in this panel. Yeah, I would like to say some words about the story of this decade from a perspective of Central Eastern European Central Bank. So I think in the main conclusion we can agree and we can see very similar trends, but of course there are differences between the region. So starting with the question why the emerging market region remains so resilient in the last couple of years in an era of a huge crisis we saw globally. One of my first answer is that I think the emerging market economies were in a better prepared situation at the end of the last decade. So relative to those situations we saw in the 80s or in the 90s, in many fields, I think the emerging market economies were in a better prepared position. There were no such a huge overheating in the economy. We saw in many cases that the current account balance of the countries remained close to zero. That's why there was no huge current account imbalances. The amount of FX reserves were at a higher level relative to the previous decades where we saw emerging market crises. And the last element is the size of the central bank balance sheets, which were at a lower level, keep the room for maneuver in a very crisis-related decade. So the comment number one for the better resilience in this very challenging environment is the better preparedness. The second factor is the very bold reaction I saw several times on the side of the central bankers and policymakers in the emerging markets. During the COVID-19 crisis, as I mentioned, there were room for maneuver in the central bank balance sheet policies. So in line with that, in our region, many central banks decided to follow the developed central banks and opened QE programs, injected fresh liquidity into the economy to compensate the very negative effects of the COVID-19 in our region. Of course, after that, the inflation and the very high inflation came to our life. I think it was pretty severe in our region. So it's worth, I'm always mentioning that, okay, the high inflation we saw globally in the last 2 years in 2022 and 2023, it was a very painful phenomenon for the global economy, but it was pretty painful phenomenon for our region. So in our case, during 2.5 years, the consumer prices increased by more than 30%. So it was a very, very severe situation for the region. But I think, and that's the good point, the central bankers realized the risk of the high inflation. They started to react in an earlier stage, in a very early stage, somewhere in the mid of 2021, so in an earlier stage than the developed world. The reaction was very aggressive. So if I compare the numbers relative to the 70s, I think the emerging market economies were able to reach the positive interest rate territory in an earlier stage than in the 70s, which is needed in my reading to deliver the inflation to a low territory again. The communication was very, very disciplined, very, very proactive, as I read in the excellent paper published by Piroska. So I think these were the factors which helped us to keep the stability in our economies. Some words about the future. because I think we have to know that this decade is the decade of the great transitions, the great volatility, maybe the great crisis. We will see or not. So I think those elements which were key in the economic growth model of the emerging markets are changing very, very significantly. So I want to mention 4 key elements which were very important for the economic growth models in the emerging markets. Number 1 is the globalization or the hyperglobalization we saw between 1990 till 2020. So of course, the emerging markets are very open economies, so we benefited from the stage of hyperglobalization. The second factor is the labor market and the relatively cheap and available labor. Of course, we also stepped into a new stage on that field. So nowadays, the demographic trend started to play against the labor supply, increasing higher and higher wage cost in this region. The third element is and I think it's especially crucial for Central Eastern Europe, is the price of energy. So of course, till 2020, we operated our growth model with cheap energy prices. Nowadays, still the energy prices in Europe is still 3 or 4 times higher than it was before the COVID-19 crisis. So of course, it's a new era. And the fourth element is the price of money. So I think in that field, the situation we can see nowadays in the US, so that the US economy can fly with higher interest rates. The US economy remains strong within this very challenging environment. It can be a challenge for the emerging markets, looking at the historical examples, because it will result that also the interest rates and the yields can remain at a higher level in the emerging markets. So that's why I'm saying we have to rethink the whole growth model, because the key pillars has changed into another direction. And of course, the risk we are facing nowadays are pretty new in many fields. So there are wars, there are geopolitical tensions. So that's why I'm saying, okay, we can be satisfied. Till now, the emerging markets remain resilient within this very, very challenging environment, but the story hasn't got to the end. So you have to remain well prepared for the new type of shocks. So that's the first thought.
Thank you very much. I like the decade of the great transition. I like that. We will come back on that, because we definitely are in a decade of transition. But let me turn now to my right, and I would like to invite Anusha Chari to give the opening remarks. Thank you. I think it's on.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. So as my fellow panelists have already said, have given us a number of insights about why this time might be different in terms of emerging markets, especially in terms of the inflation response. What we saw sequentially was that emerging markets tightened even before developed markets did, which was it was different from the past. We did see massive portfolio outflows right when the COVID shock hit, but those, again, they sort of resumed very quickly afterwards. So it was within a few months, portfolio flows to emerging markets resumed. And I think the point about less foreign currency dependence in terms of external financing is extremely important. And what goes with that is the development of the local currency bond markets and the depth, and that sort of has also contributed to the resilience of emerging markets this time around. And in the past, as we saw, US monetary tightening and a strong dollar would have led to capital flight and financial crises in the emerging world. And that was, we saw that during the first take per tantrum episode in 2013. And it doesn't seem to have played out in the same way this time around. And in fact, if you look at the data, the net capital inflows into emerging markets rose to their highest levels since 2018. So there seems to be appetite for portfolio assets in emerging markets, which is very important because it's leading to a diversification of finance away from just cross-border bank lending. And with the exception of China, which saw outflows which are consistent with the Chinese growth slowdown, the geopolitical and trade tensions, the ongoing geo-economic fragmentation. But what we've seen even with China is that with the announcement of the fiscal stimulus package, flows seem to have resumed. But vulnerabilities, of course, remain. And, if there are, as we saw in the WEO report, if there are sudden eruptions in financial market volatility, this can lead to a tightening of global financial conditions. And we know that when markets enter risk-off states of the world, capital tends to flow out of emerging markets. And so that sort of volatility, if it persists, could trigger capital outflows and debt distress. And related to this is the issue of, if they're going to be continuing spikes in commodity prices and oil prices with the Middle East escalation and persistent geopolitical tensions, this could impact central banks from easing monetary policy if inflation continues to be an issue. So we saw that while emerging markets tightened before developed markets did, some have got stuck away from target. So that continues to be a challenge. And I think that on the plus side, the global monetary easing, the weakening of the US dollar and continuing fall in global inflation will be attenuating circumstances for emerging markets. But it's going to be ever so important that strong macroeconomic fundamentals be maintained because as we have seen, one of the key vulnerabilities is that more sovereign defaults may be coming down the pike, given the rollover risk is a vulnerability, given that a lot of this debt is going to be maturing in 2025. 2026. So, I'm happy to talk more about the potential debt distress and sovereign risk. But so being on a sustainable fiscal path is going to be key in order to attract foreign investment, which is going to be important for financing current account deficits. And we have to keep the fact that fiscal capacity in emerging markets is limited given the pandemic era spending, the wars, the conflict, etc. And I think it's important to talk about the infrastructure financing gap and how the private sector could be incentivized to take an informed risk-taking via informed risk-taking in order to and what role the multilaterals can play in this informed risk-taking to catalyze private investment. Because at the moment, when it comes to this infrastructure financing gap, it's important to recognize that while many strides have been made, 1.2 billion people have no electricity, 1 billion people live greater than 2 kilometers from an all-season road, and 2.6 billion people do not have internet access. So the World Bank has talked about moving from billions to trillions in infrastructure investment, and what is the way that rich country capital can be incentivized to flow to emerging markets. And data is going to be a key piece of all of this, because at the moment, governments and investors are flying blind because we don't have sufficient data on rates of return on emerging market and developing country infrastructure. And without data, there can be no rational prioritization of international resource allocation. So why don't I stop here?
Thank you.
And
That's a very important point that you raise. And let me, last but not least, Firoska.
Where did you push?
I
Here?
think
Yeah.
it's just on.
It just go, oh,
Yeah.
wonderful. Full automatization. Thank you very much. I would focus, following actually our chair's suggestion, I will focus on the context in which all these emerging market positive trends have evolved. Before that, perhaps I just want to make one point. One is that with all these institutional improvements, framework improvements, monetary policy, fiscal policy, and the capacity then to act in an anti-cyclical manner, with all this came, of course, with some costs, and some of the costs is high debt. And I know that we are going to come to that. And that has now really shaken up the emerging market group. So you have one group which to where Governor Velarde's and Governor Virag's countries belong, which are really the matured, I would call matured emerging markets, which really have acquired the characteristic in terms of capacity to policy action, credibility, acquire the characteristic of higher income countries. And then you have emerging markets which are really lagging behind. So the emerging market group is really split up. And that maybe in the next round we can take into account. But what is it's even more important to then consider the global context in which this is happening. And what we have in mind is the global financial safety net. Not a very nice word, but we are all used to that. So I'm going to say a few words about what that is. We all know, but just to put the latest numbers, and then to offer some slightly controversial ideas for future debate. So we both know that, and I have this only IMF data, because there's so many issues of measurement and source, exchange rate evaluations, you include gold or not include, which is like now more relevant, but sticking to the IMF data on that, the IMF has this COFAR monitoring, volatile monitoring, and from that there is a lot of data coming in. So it's all that information. So it shows that it has two components. One is the self-insurance. We haven't talked about it that much, but it's huge accumulation of FX reserves. And then the other is the external insurance, which is the IMF traditionally, right? If you go back in chart the 1980s, and which has shrunk in importance, that the little orange, and close to, I don't even want to say 5% or so in the total global financial safety net, and at the expense of other elements. So there's a big change relative to the 1980s. We have bilateral swaps. Governor Velarde has already mentioned the importance of that. We know what it is. The globally systemic central banks, the US Fed, most of all, but also the European Central Bank, and in many respects also the People's Bank of China has set up its currency swap and repo operations, and that has become a very important part of the global safety net. That's what you see in the 2022 column, as well as same time regional financial arrangements. At the same time, international reserve, which is kind of in between the dark, remained very important in this safety net. So the country's self-insurance is still very, very significant. It's concentrated. Asia is the leader. As you know, after the global Asian crisis, 97, 98, they really had a deliberate policy to increase self-insurance, but also regional banks. So a little bit on the self-insurance, the increases have been in reserves, as I mentioned, the Asian crisis. Currently, we have about between 12 and 13 trillion of US dollars reserved, 55% in US dollars. We know that it's, going down. There's a de-dollarization. I don't think it's very really very marked, but there is some shift. Gold very recently is taking up more share. And then the second part is this international insurance, and this is where I'd like really to focus a little bit more. But you see he is from 1995 to 2022 or 3, the mechanisms. In red is, and it's in US dollars, so it's not a share, it's in US dollars. In red is the International Monetary Fund facilities. In between is light blue is the regional financial arrangements. These are, you know, in Europe, the European Commission, various facilities, the ESM. You heard the chief economist speaking just in the previous panel. The Asian 3 Chiang Mai initiative, also heard the representative here just a few minutes ago. Latin America has a reserve fund. I'm not sure how well that operates, but it all exists, and they became important and much more important than the IMF, which operates globally. So these are the regional arrangements. And then on top of it is these bilateral swap lines by the ECB, the US Fed, of course, then the ECB and the POBC. Now, we know that after 2008, 2009, and you see the global financial crisis, these operations, the currency swaps, which had existed with friendly other advanced country central banks already for decades, you know, the Fed and the Bank of England, the ECB, the Bank of Japan, etc., Australia, etc. But it was extended to a number of good policy pursuing countries, and which also strategically very important for the US, Mexico, Brazil, South Korea, and others. But it was not global at that time. So the global financial crisis, you know, expanded a little bit the use of these instruments, but were not global to provide dollar liquidity to countries which needed either swap or repo form. After the pandemic, during the pandemic rather, when there was clear test situations, we all remember March, April 2020, the Fed beautifully, phenomenally, and ingeniously introduced a facility, the FEMA, which I have to read up because I always forget, Foreign and International Monetary Authority Financial Arrangements. So that's the FEMA, which is practically available, a repo operation, practically available for all monetary authorities other than, you know, North Korea and whatever. So that it's sort of globally really available. And there was in uptake. And the beauty, of course, of this is that you use it once and it's available, then you don't have to use it, because this is a preventative instrument. The ECB also stepped up its game in this area, finally took responsibility for what I would call the Eurozone sphere of interest. Much of Central Eastern Europe, definitely Southern Europe is Euroized. Some countries have this as you know, unilaterally introduced as a currency. So for them, these arrangements during stress were extremely important. And the ECB provided big amounts, very publicly, very well explained, both repos for countries which are closer to the bloc for one reason or the other, and also to countries which are not only not close to the Eurozone, but not even in the EU. So Albania got repo operations, North Macedonia got repo operations, and a host of other countries, including Hungary, from that the governor is here on the panel. So these have been really, really very beneficial. And again, you don't have to use it. You know that it's a standing, and these are standing facilities. It's available at a time of stress. Similar increase in regional financing arrangements, and the IMF share is really, I mean, small. Now the IMF is trying, so they have introduced a number of liquidity instruments and with a lot of acronyms. There is the foreign credit lending facility, the short-term liquidity line, the precautionary liquidity line with little variants. But the bottom line is, I mean, we are among themselves, the bottom line is that they are not very attractive, unfortunately, as a precautionary instruments. So their importance, their take-up has been very limited. So my point is, and that's my last slide, is that we see a global, supposedly global financial safety net, which is increasingly bilateral or regional. So the global partners' importance is reducing, and the regional or bilateral, with the bilateral swaps and repos, they are increasing. You know, and maybe that's the new normal in international cooperation, and then the new way of multilateralism, that you use these levers, political and other levers.
Or fragmentation.
More fragmentation. Well, it's the political reality, you know. Yeah, right, Max.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Now, just one, but I would say also is that it was high time that these type of facilities were put at the larger availability, because we have cross-border big banks operating in various currency areas, and not only, you know, in England and in Europe, Frankfurt, etc., for which there had been traditional swap arrangements, but you know, in Latin America, in Europe, even in Asia, definitely. So it made all the sense. It's a very good crisis instrument, but it's not, you know, your old Bretton Woods type multilateral. They need more transparency. Not only the Chinese arrangement is a little bit different. It's more trade flow supportive in terms of swaps. But I would say that even for the ECB, I cannot resist just to mention that, you know, there was a difference in the ECB's approach to providing the facility for Poland, which got a swap, which is your local currency against the euro, which is, of course, what you want to have, because you can print your own local currency, so it gives you the flexibility, versus repo, which Hungary got, which you have to provide the asset in euros, so in the FX, and then there is a more a maturity issue. But of course, you know, the overall kind of support of the central bank behind that operation, the big central bank, the systemic central bank. But it wasn't clear why Poland got, you know, a swap and Hungary a repo, maybe as a political, but you know, the conditions should be, the riskiness of this operation and risk assessment, creditworthiness should be clearer. And I am afraid to say, you know, many of us are ex-members, that the IMF is unlikely to grow in importance due to lack of interest of what it can offer. There can be a good talk about SDR reallocation for very good kind of subset of service, poverty reduction, climate swaps, etc., but not as a kind of a global instrument. And finally, allow me, Max, to be a little bit provocative. I think we can think about extensions along these, you know, in the global safety net. One is on the domestic, and I think that's the most controversial. But let me mention, balance sheet operations of central banks prove to be really helpful tools now in a large number of mature emerging markets, as both Government Velarde and Barnabas highlighted. So to me, that's part of the menu tool of the safety net. But more importantly, and particularly if we look at emerging markets which are lagging behind, which are in a very vulnerable position, very high debt burden, very high debt service, we can say that debt restructuring in one form or the other could be also part of the safety net. And I stop.
Thank you so much. Very interesting. And actually, this recomposition of the safety net towards more bilateral regional is also, as you said, a reflection of the geopolitical context we are in, for sure. We have about 15 minutes. I just want to be sure that we go back a little bit to the point raised by the deputy governor about we are in a new world. I mean, we hear this a lot. It's a new regime. I don't know how to define it, but for sure, the pillars of the success of EM during the 90s and until the great financial crisis, at least, have changed. So maybe if I can turn again to the governors, from your perspective, what are the implications of this new regime for the monetary policy in emerging markets? Is it going to be that interest rate will have to be kept higher, also in order to deal with this new challenge, protectionism, volatility, geopolitics, etc.? Or what else? Because I think that's a very important point when we think ahead, when we think a little bit more forward-looking. Maybe we can start from Governor Belot.
Okay, sure. First, maybe the safety net of the IMF is too small. During COVID, we took the physical credit line. They have been pressurized since 2009 to take it. We did. But in COVID, you didn't know if it was going to last 4 months, 8 months, 12 months. So we took it. But we went to half of it 2 years later. And we went to half because we had a very radical president. So we didn't want the market to believe that they have taken the line out. And now we are zero. But it's too small. Of course, we might need it even a small amount sometimes, who knows? Going to your point, with the safety net, the monetary policy of the states, more than Europe, from the states, has increased financial wealth so much that even a small amounts of that portfolio can mean a lot of inflows or outflows when the reverse, of course, no? So probably we need even a bigger safety net, in part because the financial wealth has grown much more than GDP, in part because of the monetary policy. But going to your point, first, probably we're going to return to a situation more similar to 2008, before Lehman. 90s, and even the start of this century, you have the integration of China to the world economy, you have a pressure down on prices, what was called the great moderation at that time. Probably that scenario is not longer here. It might be the opposite. If you increase tariffs, you will have more inflation here. If you deport workers, you have more inflation here. So yes, because of inflation, probably there will be more pressure for high interest rate. And also, I don't see for neither party here too much worry about the fiscal deficit. So bigger debt is probably impact on higher real rate of interest. And that, of course, will affect the interest rate in the rest of the world. What we are seeing, for example, that those of the Open Market Committee, they have been increasing long-term rate little by little. It starts 2.9 now, 0.9 real. And many people, if it should be even above 1%, who knows, 1.1, 1.2, whatever. So even the terminal rate probably will be higher. And that affects the terminal rate everywhere. We have had discussion among many central bank governors. The idea of most of them is that the neutral rate probably is a little bit higher than before. So probably the scenario will be with higher rate of interest than before, and maybe more pressure of inflation in the States, not in the rest of the world, because what China is not going to sell to the States is going to sell to other countries. So, but here, probably in the States, there might be more pressure on prices, no?
I absolutely agree with the main arguments, with the governor. Yeah, I think one issue is as I mentioned, the very strong U.S. economy. So the U.S., if the U.S. economy remains strong, and the U.S. economy will fly with high debt to GDP ratio, with large fiscal deficit numbers. So at the end of the day, it will result higher yields in the U.S. market. And I think in the short term, it can generate more issues on the emerging markets. So I think we have to know that. And I think the other elephant in the house is the labor market, especially in our region. So I think we have to know that within the human history, we are turning to that phase of our economic life where the demographic trends start to play against the economic growth in many countries. So not only in the developed world, but also in many countries in Asia. So what does it mean? In our case, we can see very tight labor market conditions in the whole region, in the Central Eastern European region, generating strong wage outflow. So I think there is a need for a wage convergence in the Central Eastern European region because we are sitting in the middle of a fully flexible and open labor market. So of course, if there will be no wage convergence in the Central Eastern European region, the skilled labor will lift the region. So that's why we have to know there is a need for wage convergence. I think it is happening nowadays, and it will continue in the coming years. So what does it mean from a macro policy point of view? We have to prepare for tighter fiscal and monetary policy conditions. So generally, I strongly believe the fiscal and the monetary policy have to remain in a tighter position, because the wage convergence will generate a lot of demand push in the economy looking ahead, and of course it can generate inflationary risk. And as I mentioned, the other factor is the US monetary policy.
Thank you for that. Let me turn now to the question. I mean, whether the elephant in the room is debt in the US. But the other elephant is definitely the US presidential election, and also not just because about who is going to win, but more about what are the implications for the global economy, particularly in terms of protection, which would be a big change compared to the previous regime of hyperglobalization, right? I love this debate about hyperglobalization, deglobalization, because the numbers tell us a story which is a little bit mixed. We were talking yesterday about the resilience of international trade in the face of all the protection. International trade was starting to soften well before Trump arrived in power in reality. So maybe there are other structural factors at play here. But I wanted to turn over to Speaker Anusha about your perspective also from a policy perspective. How does this change in the international trade and protectionist wave will impact emerging market?
Yeah, thanks. So that's a really great question. I think what the pandemic really brought to light is issues of supply chain resilience. And I think that the reallocations that have been taking place in part have been to shore up that supply chain resilience, whether it be nearshoring, friendshoring, onshoring, etc. So I think that international trade is reallocating in a way that we are seeing more trade within the blocks rather than across blocks. And so in that sense, it's dovetailing with supply chain resilience, national security issues, issues of, say, excess capacity in China, and in certain sectors, which is driving down prices. And so there are some of those considerations, I think, that are operating on the US. Of course, the election is going to have very serious implications for economic growth, inflation, monetary policy, and US-China trade relations, which will impact the US and spillovers to emerging markets. And if we think about, the biggest concerns really stem from across-the-board tariffs that the former President Trump has been proposing. And I think it's important to distinguish between targeted tariffs in certain areas that are coming from national security or supply chain resilience concerns from across-the-board tariffs, which could be quite costly. So I think that, clearly it's going to impact certain countries that are more exposed to, which include emerging markets. So, the big trading partners are Canada, Switzerland, Mexico, but you have a number of other emerging markets like Taiwan, Singapore, South Korea, Thailand, Japan, Chile, India, Brazil,
It's a long list.
It's a very long list because for many countries, the US is the biggest trading partner. So I think that there are going to be countries that are going to be directly impacted. Maybe the commodity exporters are going to be more insulated. It's not clear whether, what's being proposed is tariffs as a negotiating tool, like, for example, on issues of immigration related to, say, Mexico. And then the question is, if these tariffs go into effect, then what is the response going to be? Countries could retaliate with lower prices. When it comes to China, reciprocal tariffs are more unlikely because they're, it's going to hurt the Chinese economy more than it's going to hurt the US economy. But there are other measures that may not be tariff measures, such as exchange rate depreciation, withholding critical supplies of critical minerals, divesting of US assets, etc., or reducing imports from the US. So the biggest imports that China had from the US were soybeans, integrated circuits, and crude oil. And so there you could see a diversification that actually benefits emerging markets in the sense of Brazil supplying soybeans, or Asia supplying the integrated circuits, and Saudi Arabia, for example, supplying crude oil.
Thank you very much for that. I'm just minding of all the time. I just want to give another opportunity on the safety net, because I work a lot with central bank. Definitely central banks have relied largely on foreign exchange reserve to deal with inflation shock. Some central banks basically use FX reserve to support the currency, to have a more deflationary coming into the country. Do you see this change in your research on the global safety net in the composition, which eventually will lead to significant change in the future about the role of foreign exchange reserve? First question. And do you see any link between geopolitics, sanction against FX reserve, where basically we're going to see countries, let's say we're going to see we could talk about friendly reshoring in the area of the safety net, where basically you do swap agreement with country that will not subject you to sanction.
I think it's exactly what you're saying, that this kind of regionalization, blocalization, nearshoring is not simply on trade and global supply chain security, but it will be also on financial relations. I think that's what we are getting. So the picture seems to be, to me, quite complete. One small thing about the sanctions. In research, I haven't seen evidence. It's not my own research, so I researched a little bit. Evidence of the US and friendly allies sanctions on Central Bank of Russia, sort of the freezing of reserves having an adverse impact yet on the diversification sort of away from those currencies, in which from the dollar essentially. So there is no clear evidence, but maybe it's just a question of time. Or the sanctions also, have a tendency to lose their effectiveness, and has to be, reinvented from time to time, as we know. But I agree with you. Of course, self-insurance, particularly when there's so much uncertainty, be it US election, be it geopolitical risk, be it the behavior of an imperial, weakened but very hurt superpower between Asia and Europe. So these risks, or some imperial resurrection in Asia. So these are very big risks, and self-insurance, even though we like, as economists, we like to say it's costly, it's better pool, better insurance, but the fact of the matter is that cost might worth that money.
Let's say FX reserve is still very important. So they're playing with fire, I would say, when they talk about sanction and confiscation of FX reserve, if I may say so. We're really at the time. I just want to be sure if there is any question from the audience, please. I don't know if there is a microphone. Yeah. Probably we can hear you, but with a microphone, it will be easy.
Thank you. My question is mostly for Piroska. It would be great if you could put that slide about the composition of the GF, the Global Financial Safety Net, back there. Because my question, Piroska, is whether maybe the relevance of the IMF is larger than what you show there, because as we know, these regional financial arrangements, beyond a certain threshold, if you want to borrow from them, you need to have an IMF arrangement. an upper tranche arrangement. So I would say, I see it this
As a
way.
catalyst.
The IMF is somehow outsourcing the financing, and the regional financial arrangements are outsourcing conditionality and monitoring. So I believe that that is minimizing the influence of the IMF. If you look just at what the IMF is lending itself.
Okay, I think I agree with you. The data is from the IMF. So it's their presentation. But you're right that the IMF has this catalyst role, and that is probably not well captured with the direct impact only, and the indirect impact with the catalyst role is not there. We have seen it in Latin America, we have seen it in Europe, particularly after the global financial crisis, where there were clear coupling of the regional and the IMF arrangements, and taken good advantage of in terms of conditionality. So I agree.
Any more questions for our panelists? Here, I guess that's the last one, and then we close it because.
Thank you very much. My fascinating panel. My question is generally directed at our academic experts. Professor Chari, you talked about methods of increasing investor confidence in this climate. And I was just wondering, especially when I look at Professor Piroshka's chart here, that given the limited role of the IMF and given the rise of bilateral debt swaps, whether by Bank of China and more recently by India using a portion of its $710 billion FX reserves, that whether some of that local investment might in fact follow the shelter of those bilateral debt swaps in terms of targeted investment from the countries that are leading the debt swaps. And if that becomes the pattern, then what are the implications for the previous multilateral order in which multilateral stability was supposed to provide that climate? Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's also related to the point that Piroshka made about the fragmentation. It's not just fragmentation of trade, but also fragmentation of finance and the financial networks. And I think that the question that you're asking is that so I think that the multilateral still will play a very important role. It might be a different sort of role, which is providing, I was talking about informed risk-taking. What do we mean by informed risk-taking? Let's take an infrastructure investment, like building a road in some country. And then you have this background of this safety net, but what is it going to take to incentivize private capital to invest in that country? We really need data. And what does the World Bank have? They have tons of data on their projects, of economic rates of return, financial rates of return, et cetera. And I actually think that those synergies in terms of private capital, but multilateral institution data could really inform that risk-taking and facilitate the resource allocation to close the, I've talked about the infrastructure financing gap, but it could be targeted towards any sort of investments that are going into these countries. And then they have the safety net of, let's say it's a US company that's investing in an emerging market. The whole idea here with the safety net is to be able to liquefy, because, the FEMA repo, you have to provide collateral. So rather than just sitting on those reserves, just using those reserves and liquefying them, just like you would with a committed credit line, which can then be drawn upon. So it's, I think that those synergies could operate, but I think that it also frees up capital from multilaterals if it can be used, if the private sector could be incentivized to invest in emerging markets in a covered sort of way.
Thank you. Maybe very quickly for the two governors, how important are FX reserve going to remain the fundamental pillar of self-insurance, or in this new geopolitical context, in this fragmentation, you see swap lines or something new which will emerge to become at least as equally important as foreign exchange reserves in the future?
So look, I think that basic rule is still true. So if you have your own currency, the role of the FX reserve is still important. And I think looking ahead, the importance can increase again. So again, we are preparing for an environment where we will face very unpredictable shocks. So within this environment, I think it's better to live with higher reserves than lower. But I also agree absolutely with Piroska that there is a new way of thinking in some cases, in case of the big central banks, to provide swap facilities to those central banks who are operating in their own currency zone or near to the currency zone. So I think the flexibility is also needed on the side of the swap agreements.
The final word.
First, our accumulation reserve was unintended at first. It was because we didn't want such a quick appreciation when there was a big inflows. Actually, we believe that maybe we had too many reserves. We were even buying treasury bonds in dollars because we believe we had too many reserves. But we had this outflow in 2021, and we was happy to have those reserves. Otherwise, our intervention would have not been successful. When they saw we had enough ammunition, it was very strong. And yeah, of course, we would love to have more sublines. Actually, I asked for I talked with the Treasury in 2009 for a subline, but they said no.
Anyway, so the role of FX reserve is going to remain important, just to reassure everybody for the time being. So let me thank you very much, all our panelists. I think this is the end of the conference. I don't know, Mark, if you want to say a few words or.
Yeah, it's the end of the day, it's the end of the last 2 days of the conference. Thank you, Max. Thank you, Governor, Deputy Governors, Academic. I think we have 2 excellent days. Thank you, Max and UBS, for your support. And we look forward to seeing you again, hopefully in April in Washington.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You don't go to Basel match, no? You don't go to Basel. I will see you there, brother.
Yeah, we met there. Yeah.
We met at Budapest, I believe.
I don't know if you remember me. Thank you so much. I remember you were told, but that's your call. Wow, I was for your, today.
Yeah, certainly. We talked, we discussed.
We discussed the whole cash system, the central bank. So pleasure to see you again. Now there is a debate going on.
I forgot everything.
Nagyon jó volt a pontok. Gratulálok. Sicura to have it there, and you leave it because it's not gonna be the size, it's not gonna be, it's not gonna be, but it's still important.
At least, thank you very much.